okay, you want an avoidant to miss you, then stop trying to convince them you're worth missing. Because here's the truth. The lung, the more you chase, the more they vanish into deep, the more you speak, the more they go silent, and the more you fight for connection, the more they crave distance. But if you really want to make an avoidant miss you, don't send another text. Don't post a story hoping they'll watch. Don't stalk their timeline. Don't try to remind them of what they're losing. No, you go silent, because silence to an avoidant is power, it's confusion, it's pressure, it's mystery. And that mystery get cracks through the walls thought they'd built forever. An avoidant personality does not respond to words, apologies, promises, or even grand gestures the way a secure person might. They are wired to retreat from closeness, to disconnect when intimacy feels too intense, and to self-protect when emotions start to surface. So when you flood them with messages, explanations, or emotional pleas and fall into deep, you are not pulling them closer, you are pushing them deeper into avoidance. They read your words not as love, but as pressure, and they interpret your passion as threat. That's why silence is not just the opposite of communication with an avoidant. It is the most potent form of power you possess, because silence does what language cannot. It unsettles their nervous system. It creates a vacuum where their control used to be. It confronts them without confronting them. It doesn't beg, it doesn't chase, it doesn't justify. It just exists. And that existence is deafening and fall into deep. Avoidants expect the people in their lives to fill in the emotional gaps they refuse to address themselves. They've built a lifetime of defense mechanisms to avoid vulnerability, accountability, and the terror of true connection. But when you go silent, you shift the dynamic completely. You introduce a force they're unfamiliar with, a reality where you're not reacting, you're not over-explaining and fall to deep. You're not even present to absorb the fallout. And this isn't about playing games, it's about breaking the cycle. Deep, you're not withholding communication to manipulate. You're withholding it because you finally understand that your piece isn't up for negotiation, and fall into deep. You're stepping out of the dance. You're breaking the rhythm they depend on to feel in control. And that silence to deep, that silence hits them in a place they didn't know existed. Every time you stay quiet, you take your energy back. You take your power back. You reclaim your role in the dynamic. Because the truth is, avoids often feel most powerful when the other person is emotionally invested and visibly trying, and your effort becomes their oxygen. But when you stalking, when you stop showing them that you're emotionally available 247 and fall into deep, they feel something far scarier than conflict. They feel your absence. And that absence echoes through their mind and fall into deep, because it tells them something they never expected to hear. You are no longer under their spell. When you use silence and fall into deep, you're no longer trying to repair what they keep breaking. You're no longer trying to translate your love into a language they refuse to speak. You are not their translator, therapist, or emotional punching bag. You are your own protector now. And silence is your armor. It creates space between your soul and their chaos. It sets a boundary that screams without volume. Deep of the avoidant, who once felt secure in your constant effort, now starts to question everything. They start wondering if they've gone too far. Deep. They start wondering if they've lost you. They start realizing that the control thought they had wasn't real. It was borrowed from your empathy, fall into deep, borrowed from your emotional labor, borrowed from your inability to let go. But now you've let go, and they can feel it. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means everything is happening, but it's happening without them. Deep. And that, to an avoidant is torture, because they don't know how to fight for someone. They only know how to retreat. But when you retreat first, when you retreat without noise, without drama, what bitterness, they have no script. They have no defense. They have no idea how to respond. And this confusion is what begins to shake them. It stirs their still water. It challenges their illusion of control. Most people believe that to be heard, you must speak louder. But with an avoidant, the opposite is true. The louder you speak, the more they shut down, the more emotional you get, the more they detach. But when you grow silent, not from rage, but from realization, you trigger something primal in them. Into deep. A silent exit carries weight. It feels intentional. It's not a tantrum. It's not an emotional threat. It's not, I'm leaving until you fix this. It's simply gone. And that kind of departure doesn't echo like a scream. It resonates like an earthquake. The avoidant has always believed they hold the power because they care less, because they feel less, because they stay detached. But the second you become even less emotionally reactive than them, they begin to panic. Not on the surface, not in public, but deep down, and fall into deep, in the quiet corners of their psyche, in the hours they spend scrolling your old messages, in the silence of your absence where your words used to live. You see, into deep. They may never tell you, but they feel it. They feel your silence as loudly as they once felt your devotion. And now that it's missing deep, they don't know who they are without it. They built their safety around your emotional availability, around your constant validation, around your willingness to show up no matter how they treated you. But silence removes that safety. Silence exposes their dependence. Silence reveals that they weren't as emotionally detached as they pretended to be. And now they're confronted with a version of you they can't predict, into deep, can't control, and can't replace. That's the power of your silence. It turns the emotional tables without uttering a word. Silence is strength, and silence is self-respect. Silence is the moment you decide to stop bleeding for someone who won't even admit they're cut and fall into deep. It's the moment you step out of their emotional maze and realize you were the one keeping the connection alive. It's the moment you stop giving CPR to something they left on life support. It's not cruel. It's clarity, fall into deep. And it teaches the avoidant a lesson they can't learn through comfort. It teaches them that someone who values themselves doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't explain their worth. They just disappear from dynamics that drain them. You didn't lose your voice. You chose not to use it into deep because you finally saw the truth. Your silence is louder than your pain. Your silence is louder than your love. Your silence is louder than every conversation that never changed anything. And in that silence, they finally hear the one thing they never expected. You're done. Fall into deep. Avoidants do not miss love that's constantly given. They miss the emotional distance that makes them feel like they're losing something they thought they could always take for granted. Into deep, that's the paradox that shocks most people. The more available you are to an avoidant, the less valuable your presence feels to them. To deep, you could give your entire soul to an avoidant, and they will still crave the space you refuse to give, not because you're doing something wrong, but because their nervous system is wired to pull away when closeness becomes too real. They associate vulnerability with danger, not connection. So your love, deep, your openness, your consistency, all of that becomes overwhelming, even threatening. That's why detachment isn't rejection. It's revelation. It reveals to them what constant closeness never could. It shows them what it feels like to be without you. It gives them the emotional space they think they want into deep, until they realize that space is just emptiness without your energy in it when you detach emotionally. Not with bitterness and fall into deep, but with peace. It shocks their nervous system into noticing what they've been avoiding all along, the weight of your presence. Because your presence was never passive. It was active. It carried the emotional responsibility of the entire connection, and fall into deep. It gave meaning to the moments they took for granted. It held the safety they refused to create. And now that it's gone, they're left alone with the silence they once claimed to need. But this silence doesn't feel peaceful. It feels cold, hollow. Punishing, fall into deep, because for the first time, they're being forced to feel the very emotions they've been deflecting back onto you. You see, and avoidants feel safe when you are emotionally overinvested. That's when they know they can pull away without consequence. That's when they know they don't have to show up because you'll be there anyway. But emotional detachment flips the entire system. When you detach deep, you remove the invisible rope that kept pulling them back to safety. You're no longer their emotional safety net. You're no longer the guaranteed presence that cushions every withdrawal. And that is terrifying for them, because they didn't expect you to ever stop giving and fall into deep. They thought your loyalty was infinite. They thought you would always wait for them to heal, to open, to choose you properly into deep. But detachment says you've chosen yourself first. And that's the one thing they were never prepared for when you detach and fall into deep. You're not withholding love, you're withdrawing from respect. You're not punishing them, you're protecting your peace. And this shift is not subtle, it's seismic. It creates an internal collapse within the avoidant that feels like panic dressed as confusion. They don't know how to reach you anymore. And fall in deep, they don't know how to read you. The emotional blueprint they relied on, your reactions, your patterns, your energy, it's all gone to deep. And now they're left trying to navigate an emotional world they never learned how to exist in. For once, they're the ones on the outside looking in, and that's where your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was. Emotional detachment is not about pretending not to care. It's about caring enough to let go of what hurts you. It's about waking up one day and realizing that your feelings can no longer be a one-way transaction. To deep, it's realizing that your worth is not measured by how much pain you can tolerate in silence. You detach because you've finally seen the pattern for what it is. You fall into deep, a cycle of closeness followed by withdrawal, connection followed by avoidance, love followed by coldness, into deep. And you're done dancing for someone who only hears the music when it stops. Avoidants often fantasize about being alone until they finally are deep. And when that solitude is no longer a choice, but a consequence, that's when the discomfort sets in. That's when they start to question their own behavior to deep. Not because you explained it, but because your detachment made them feel it. You can't lecture someone into self-awareness, but you can remove your energy and let them sit in the silence of what they lost. Your detachment becomes the lesson. It becomes the mirror. And for the first time, and fall into deep. They can't blame you for the reflection they see and fall into deep. When you emotionally detach, you stop managing their reactions. You stop softening your truth to make them comfortable. You stop shrinking your needs just to maintain the connection. You no longer ask, what do they need from me? You start asking to deep, what do I need from myself? And the moment you do that, you're no longer participating in a performance. You're living in your truth, and that truth is magnetic. Not because it makes you cold, but because it makes you powerful. Fall into deep. Your detachment tells the avoidant something they never expected to hear from you. And fall into deep. You're no longer available for emotional neglect disguised as love. Avoidants thrive on emotional ambiguity. And into deep, they want to keep things just unclear enough that they can have access to your heart without ever fully committing to it. But emotional detachment removes the ambiguity. It says, I am no longer part of a system where I lose myself to keep you comfortable. I am no longer staying in a connection where my value is measured by how much pain I can absorb. I am no longer watering dead plants just because I once believed in the garden. And this level of clarity pierces through the fog they hide behind, because for the first time into deep, you're not just walking away, you're doing it with emotional authority. The most powerful message you can ever send to an avoidant isn't a paragraph into deep, a voicemail, or a final goodbye. It's your silence wrapped in detachment. It's your energy disappearing without explanation. And fall into deep, it's the complete absence of emotional labor. That's what makes them stop. That's what makes them think, because detachment removes the one thing they relied on most, your emotional availability. And without it, they don't feel powerful. They feel exposed, vulnerable, off balance. They start to miss what they thought they could replace. They start to crave the depth they once rejected. Not because they've changed overnight, but because your absence changed the atmosphere. Detachment is not cruel. It's sacred. It's the reclamation of your emotional dignity. And it's the quiet realization that you are worthy of a love that doesn't require you to bleed for it. And that realization is the loudest wake-up call an avoidant will ever receive. Because when the energy they took for granted is no longer accessible and fall into deep, they begin to see its true value. Not in the moment you leave, but in the moments after. When they reach for the version of you they once knew, and realize that version no longer exists. You've outgrown the pain. You've risen above the patterns. You've chosen yourself in silence and fall into deep, and that silence is the sound of transformation they never saw coming. And fall into deep. They will remember you, not because you begged, but because you were the only who had the strength to stop explaining your worth. The only one who realized your silence was worth more than 1,000 conversations. The only one who didn't play the game, but ended it with grace, deep. And that kind of exit, it leaves a scar, a beautiful one, because it's not the kind of wound that bleeds. It's the kind that aches in the quiet and fall into deep. The kind that whispers at night, the kind that lingers when everything else fades. They don't miss who fought the hardest to deep. They miss who finally had nothing left to prove. They miss the one who didn't need to shout to be heard to deep. The one who stopped participating in their confusion and started prioritizing clarity. The one who didn't ask them to meet halfway, but simply walked the rest of the way alone. And that silent walk away, that is the moment the avoidant finally realizes the truth. They were never in control. Your silence becomes the greatest contrast to the chaos they've known their whole lives. It becomes the line they never thought you'd cross. Fall into deep, the boundary they didn't believe you'd set. And when you do, it shakes the foundation of their false emotional security into deep. It rewrites the story they've been telling themselves, that they don't need anyone, that they don't care, that they can detach forever. But when you detach first and do it with peace, with elegance, with nothing left to say, they begin to feel everything they worked so hard